Good morning, everybody. It's very nice to be here. We have these conversations so often. We have them in our kitchens. We have them in our offices around the water cooler. We have them in forums like this. And we're always talking about affordable housing. And I think we really need to get real about what is affordable housing and how do we actually make it work in our own local contexts and then across the continent. So that's the focus that I'm going to be looking at today. There we are. So this is a development that some of you may know of. It's in Kigali in Rwanda. It's called Vision City. And so perhaps that's an image of our vision of residential development. It wasn't originally touted as an affordable housing development, but it was built by the Rwanda Social Securities Board on their land that they'd accessed. So it had quite strong support from the government. That was put out, the yellow houses here were about $500,000. And on the right-hand side, the white houses in the order of about $125,000, maybe up to about $200,000 a unit. We have a challenge here of targeting. When that development was released, the prices were slashed after units didn't sell. Some units did sell and they sold for cash. But very many units didn't sell and prices were slashed by about 30%. And that was exciting. They were made available for civil servants to buy. Again, that didn't transpire and that there weren't any buyers. And so just a quote from the newspaper in the bottom here. In January 2019, the two-bedroom apartment was put down to 63 million shillings, down from 108 million shillings, which was about $125,000. And the argument was these apartments have for some time now been selling at 60% discount because the government of Rwanda offered over 27 billion as infrastructure in tax rebate to ensure that they are affordable for all workers in the civil service or in the private sector. So in that space, a shift towards a recognition, because in Rwanda, only about 2% of the urban population could afford a house that would cost $20,000. And these are houses that are targeting a very different population. Perhaps a population that would need housing, one would hope. We have a vision of these beautiful units. But actually, we can see that when they didn't sell, that market doesn't exist. So getting real about affordable housing is also about recognizing that that is where the market is. That's where the population is. And certainly if government is investing its funding to make a development that was owned by the Social Security Fund to actually sell, that seems to me a misallocation of resources. So I'd like to talk about getting real about affordability, then paying attention to delivery capacity. What is the kind of delivery capacity that we have on the continent at the moment in each of our local contexts? The financing capacity that we have. Then I think we need to get real about the municipal capacity, and then finally take a look at how that sits in the value chain. And I'm highlighting the work that I've used to support some of the arguments in this paper because I think the deep read is worthwhile. So I look forward to your comments on those documents. So affordability. Some of you may have seen this map that we produce every year now as part of our yearbook on housing finance across Africa. And what we do is we ask all of the consultants who write the profiles of each country, 55 countries, what is the profile of housing finance in that country? We say, please, can you tell us what is the cheapest newly built house that is built this year by a private sector developer? So we've taken those numbers, and you can't read them, but they are in the yearbook, and I will send them to you with pleasure. They range from an $11,500 unit in Kenya, available in Kenya, all the way through to $200,000 units, and so on. There's quite a variety. But what we did was we took those numbers, then we took the reported mortgage rates that banks are reporting they have mortgages available for. It doesn't mean that there are mortgages necessarily in the country, but those are the rates that are reported. And then we fed that together in a calculator with income data of urban household incomes to quantify, to calculate what is the percent of the urban population that can afford the cheapest newly built house in that country that year given current mortgage rates. And then we put it on a map. Green is good news, red is not so good news. And you can see we have quite a red map. Now there's a lot of stories in that. Some of it has to do with the cost of housing itself, low costs, high costs, but some of it also has to do with the cost of finance. And then, of course, the diversity of incomes. So paying attention to what is actually happening in a country in terms of those three factors, the cost of the house, the finance, and the incomes, is very important. Of course, none of this says anything about scale, because those are units that are going for 11,500. There were 85 of those built last year, and in the second phase of that same project, there aren't any. So, meanwhile, be that as it may, we've proven that we know how to build something for 11,500. So we did a thought experiment, and we said, what would it look like if that $11,500 unit was available everywhere? And let's say there was enough scale. And this is what the map would look like, which then shows us we also have a financing problem and an income problem. It's not just the unit price. Even if we were building housing for $11,500 everywhere, we still would have a housing affordability challenge. We need to get our heads around that. It means that there's a whole range of different delivery methods we need to think about, financing methods, all of the different components, how they fit together. Okay, so let's look at delivery capacity. We recently did a study in Kenya, and within that it was noted, and I'm sure it's been noted elsewhere before, that only about 10% of total housing production in Kenya is built by the formal construction industry. Now that's surprising, because you would think this is a country that's prioritizing housing delivery, but you've got a lot of small-scale household level or micro builders who are developing, who are not part of that formal construction industry, and they're contributing to housing production in this country and, in fact, all over the continent. Now, how do we finance that? Because that is capacity I don't want to lose by suddenly formalizing everything and saying, let's use large-scale developers. Large-scale developers have all sorts of additional costs that come with them. They're formal companies that fit within tax structures and regulatory barriers and so on, all of those issues. Plus, they would go for large-scale developments which need large tracts of land, which would mean a lot of infrastructure investment. Smaller-scale developers and household builders can do urban infill. They can build in backyards and so on, but we don't have a financing structure to support that kind of delivery. In addition to that, there is the technical capacity of builders as well, and to build the technical capacity of small-scale builders would be quite important. Third, let's looking at financing capacity. Now, this is a development that we went and visited in Abidjan, where in Côte d'Ivoire there's a commitment by the government, not dissimilar to the Kenyan commitment, to build 150,000 affordable houses. This is what it looked like, and we were there on a Thursday, so there wasn't anybody on site. And it seemed that what had happened in that context was that the development had started, it had funding to start, but it ran out of money. So the construction financing arrangement was inappropriate. Now, why is that? In part, the banks are struggling to lend to developers because the developers don't have track records. Well, the developers don't have track records because they can't access finance from the banks to build that track record. And we're stuck somewhere in between. This was an innovative project where they had across, I think it's 30,000 units, and they allocated it to lots of different developers to build that developer capacity. But the construction finance wasn't in place. And so you've got that problem in Abidjan. In the study that we did in Kenya, none of the developers surveyed, there was about 10, but we looked at a range of them, have delivered more than 500 units per annum consistently. So you can deliver 500 units, but that often gets stretched over a number of years. And to be able to deliver at scale, given the promises that we keep on making, I think we need to pay a lot of attention to the need to build up the small developer capacity while we grow the large-scale capacity, but we need both. We can't be precious about trying to go for large-scale developers only. Municipal capacity. Now, this is something that we often don't think about or don't talk about because it's not strictly within the housing sector. It extends more broadly. But as housing developers and investors, we rely hugely on the capacity of a municipality to say yes. And they have to say yes along the whole value chain, whether it's in terms of assembling the land and putting the infrastructure in and making investments, signing approvals, plans, and so on. And when a municipality takes a few extra days, which would be lovely, when it takes a few extra months, or sometimes in the case more than a year, to make an approval, that's going to add to the costs. And that's wasted money. If we're financing for affordable housing and the thing that costs us is the time it takes for a development to actually happen, that's just a waste of money. It's money that's going into time. So in the work that we looked at, we found that there are very serious issues in terms of infrastructure delivery as well. And we expect a municipality would put infrastructure in the ground and then everyone can build on top of the ground. That's a very good plan. It doesn't happen. So we need to think about other ways in which we can stimulate infrastructure delivery, support municipal capacity development so you have that, financial as well as human and technical, so that the infrastructure is there and that doesn't add to the cost of the housing. But at the same time, compliance and approval costs, and then again, as I said, the time. So what we then did is we took a number of typical houses, and this is a graph here of, you've got South Africa, Rwanda, and then a number of house types, Kenya, and I would urge you to take a look at the actual report where you can read the text that's in there. But what we did was we designed a typical house, developed a bill of quantities, and then had a set of quantity surveyors define how much would it cost to build these houses. And these are comparable. So on the bottom here, these are all I think these are the 55 square meter houses. These three are the same house. And then we took a look at what were the different cost components in that delivery. And I'm going to just jump to the Kenyan because I've tried to make it a bit bigger so you can see. And if you just take a look at that, now there's a different house types because we wanted to make it closer to what you would expect in Kenya. But taxes, now the PS mentioned that this morning, 16% is put on top, and we're targeting this at affordable housing. I mean, it really seems that this is one area where it would be a great opportunity to say, let's make affordable housing within the affordable housing program VAT exempt. It's not doing us any favors. Compliance costs as well, because that is really revenue that municipalities are earning just for approving signatures and making sure. Now, that's very important because that's part of the municipal revenue stream. But how about charging that to the high-end housing developments and exempting that within the space of affordable housing delivery, or changing the approach to that? In addition, there's quite high professional fees that come into that. Again, professionals are very necessary to the process, but can that be streamlined within the context of affordable housing? The developer markup, I wonder about that. I love developers to apply a markup because that means that they'll come back for more and they'll continue to develop. We need that. But let's understand whether they're pricing for inefficiencies in the system. Is that an amount that's put into the price to enable the time that is expected this development is going to take to price for that? Infrastructure was the third highest cost. And that is largely because it's being provided on site by the developer and paid for within that development, rather than spread over a full municipality. And that is a challenge, again, that municipalities themselves need to look at. And then finally, around construction costs, high materials costs, in part, that has to do with 2 minutes, sure. That has to do with a very limited manufacturing sector that is not able to deliver the building materials that are required, and consequently high imports. That needs to be considered, especially within the Kenyan context. If the Big Four agenda has housing and manufacturing, there's a great opportunity to look at those two together. Okay, so the value chain, and this is something that within the Kenyan context you're all familiar with. Across the value chain, there are problems all along. and issues that do need specific attention. And that means that the attention goes beyond the housing department to the finance department and the central bank to pay attention to macroeconomic issues. It goes into all of the other departments that engage with each one of those value chain points. And to address that so that a developer and investor can see a development happen. So, very quickly, this is basically the conclusion of all of that. How do we get real about this? And then how do you as investors and as developers structure your products? This is not going to change in the short term. It will, well, yeah, we hope that it will change in the medium term and in the longer term, but in the short term, it's not going to change. So actually, to be pragmatic, develop products and services that account for this and see how you can do that. We've seen and we've heard about a range of proposals that are set within the affordable housing program and recommendations also that we've made. I think a critical thing that must be attended to across all of the recommendations is a public-private dialogue. A lot of uncertainty that's existing at the moment, whether in Kenya or in any other country, but a dialogue between the private and the public sector to be able to negotiate what are the issues that need to be attended to across the full value chain. And let's think specifically, in fact, about that private sector widely defined, beyond housing, into manufacturing and building materials, into land assembly, and so on, all the different sectors that would participate in the housing process. But in the meantime, what do I do? What do you do? What do we all do as private individuals and companies who are trying to operate? And I think there's some really good examples that we can take comfort in, which I think I'd love you just have in your mind as we, over the next 2 days, and we deliberate these issues, where individual providers are making a plan as we hope that the environment improves itself. There's a very interesting case study about land readjustment strategies in Maputo, where they're taking down one property and building 2 properties on that same piece of land, and that's very low-income housing. Blockchain registration approaches. Andrew Chimponda, the MD of Shelter Afrique, spoke about blockchain this morning, looking at that as a form of accelerated titling. Public-private partnerships, bringing together pension funds as capital support to enable infrastructure delivery, and a good case study there with Old Mutual together with CABS in Zimbabwe. And how do you make that work over the long term, and how does the pension fund know it's actually going to get its money back of something that's traditionally what municipalities collect and hold themselves? A useful case study to look at. In terms of house construction, a very interesting mobile platform which is trying to build together, create the whole construction value chain for small-scale providers in the microfinance industry, almost like an Uber for housing. It's an app that brings together the small-scale construction industry, from building materials supply to financiers to individual contractors, bringing them all together. That's called iBuild, and I believe it's piloting. It's in Kenya and elsewhere in the continent, as well as in Asia. Also, very interesting example in South Africa, the Trust for Urban Housing Finance, TUF, it's called, provides commercial mortgage lending to small-scale landlords who become landlords for 3 or 4 units at a time, and that's contributing to the urban regeneration of inner cities. Then we have so much. In Nigeria, the Nigeria Mortgage Refinance Company is exploring how do you underwrite mortgages for informal incomes. How do you do that? Starting to get real of who the people are that you are actually trying to target. They don't have a pay slip anymore because they derive their incomes from a whole range of other sources, which are some cases very lucrative. But one has to find other ways of proving that. In Morocco, guarantees for lending to informal incomes. Some really interesting blended finance arrangements in terms of bringing together different capital providers. So among you, investors, you have different objectives. If you can discuss those and find ways in which together your objectives can support a single initiative, blended finance, a very interesting way to go. And then, of course, co-ops in Kenya. And then finally, to start thinking about the ways in which housing is not only a consumption of residential activity, for residential activity, but it's also a base for a small enterprise. And so enterprise lending techniques to apply back into housing lending. Okay, so this is my concluding slide, getting real about affordable housing. What we really need is patient capital. I hope you're all very patient. That you have a good focused target, and that you have the capacity to engage with the breadth of the issues that exist within that. However, an emphasis on the local will help you manage that strategy and manage your risk, because you can become particular about a place and about a target market, and understanding what the opportunities are in that space and applying your capital directly into that. You need to pay attention. We all need to pay attention to the value chain. And I say this very often. We all together need to form a big circle, hold hands together, and step into the middle all at once. Because we each do our own part. We can only do that if we can rely on everyone else doing their part. So attention to the value chain and really understanding that is important. How do you do that? Well, you do that with data, market analytics, and tracking the market. And that's the space that we operate in, where we try to put this information back into the market so we can all learn with one another. So that ends with an appeal to you to share your experiences, your data, good, bad stories with us, so that we can share that and collectively the industry can grow and learn. This is why we have to do it. It's a bit of a complicated picture. It's a value chain diagram that shows the primary, secondary, and tertiary sector inputs that become the intermediate inputs into the economy through housing production. Then the gross value added, which includes labor, which gives your total domestic production, which in Kenya in 2016, housing construction contributed 6.3% to GDP, and rental was another 2%. So the total contribution of housing to Kenya's economy was 8.3% of GDP. Now just that. But if we actually managed to implement this affordable housing program in Kenya, that 6.3% of construction would grow to somewhere about 14%, we estimate, 14% of GDP. And 575,000 jobs, which are currently formal and informal, mostly informal, in the construction sector, could grow to 750,000 jobs just by driving on that affordable housing program. And just think about all the extra things that that means. So housing is so much more than just housing. And that's the reason that we're all here and involved in that. This is why we need to do it. This is why it's worth it. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much. Please take a look at our website. We have lots of material on that. And I'd like to also invite you to the African Union for Housing Finance. It's an industry body that represents the housing finance industry across the continent. We have a conference in November in Cape Town. If you're interested, please let me know. Thanks so much.